drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and behavioral addictions, such as gambling and sex addiction, as well as other types of addiction. In fact, during our discussion, I learned that there are a huge range of behaviors and substances to which people can become addicted to, and that there is a common biological underpinning of all those addictions. I also learned that there is a common path to the treatment and recovery from essentially all addictions. Dr. Lemke explained that to me and explained how to think about and conceptualize our own addictions, as well as the addictions of other people who are struggling to get treatment, move through treatment, and stay sober from their addictions.
If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, this video is for you. We will discuss the underlying mechanisms that drive addictive behaviors and provide powerful tools for breaking free from harmful habits to reshape your lives.
What is dopamine? How does it work? We all hear that dopamine is this molecule associated with pleasure. I think the term dopamine hits, like I'm getting a dopamine hit from this, from Instagram or from likes or from praise or from whatever, is now commonly heard. What is dopamine, and what are maybe some things about dopamine that most people don't know, and probably that I don't know either?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are those molecules that bridge the gap between two neurons. So they essentially allow one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. Dopamine is intimately associated with the experience of reward, but also with movement, which I think is really interesting because movement and reward are linked, right? If you think about early humans, you had to move in order to go seek out the water or the meat or whatever it was. And even in the most primitive organisms, dopamine is released when food is sensed in the environment. For example, C. elegans, a very primitive worm. So dopamine is this really powerful, important molecule in the brain that helps us experience pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, but it's a really, really important one.
We are releasing dopamine in the absence of some, drug or food or experience, just sitting, being. Is that associated with how happy somebody is, their kind of baseline of happiness or level of depression?
There is evidence that shows that people who are depressed may indeed have lower tonic levels of dopamine. So that's a really reasonable thought, and there's some evidence to suggest that that may be true. The other thing that we know, and this is really kind of what the book is about, is that if we expose ourselves chronically to substances or behaviors that repeatedly release large amounts of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, that we can change our tonic baseline and actually lower it over time as our brain tries to compensate for all of that dopamine, which is more really than we were designed to experience.
With walking around my lab, and when I deciding I'm going to talk to my people, of course, when they knock on my door, it's always like, wait, why am I being bothered right now? Even though I love to talk to them, but I walk around my lab from time to time, and some people I notice, I'll say, do you have a moment? And they'll slowly turn around and say, yeah, or no, in some cases. And other people will jump the moment I say their name. They actually have a kind of a heightened startle reflex.
Right.
Is that related to impulsivity, or is what you're referring to an attempt to withhold behavior that's very deliberate under very deliberate conditions?
Yeah, so I don't think that startle reflex is necessarily related to impulsivity. That can be related to anxiety. So people who are high anxiety people will tend to have more of a startle reflex. Impulsivity is a little bit different.
What is pleasure? And how does it work at the biological level, and if it feels right at the psychological level? I think if you don't mind painting a picture of sort of the range of things that you have observed in your clinic or in life that people can become addicted to. But just to start off really simply, what is this thing that we call pleasure?
Well, I think it's actually really hard to define pleasure in any kind of succinct way, because certainly there is the seeking out of a high or a euphoria, or I think, the kind of experience that most anybody would associate with the word pleasure, but also the seeking out of those same substances and behaviors is often a way to escape pain. So, for example, when I talk to people with addiction, sometimes their initial foray into using a drug is to get pleasure, but very often it's a way to escape their suffering, whatever their suffering may be. And certainly as people become addicted, even those who initially were seeking out pleasure are ultimately just trying to avoid the pain of withdrawal or the pain of the consequences of their drug use. So I think it's, very hard to actually, define it as this unitary thing. And it's certainly not just getting a high. There are so many ways in which people sort of want to escape, which is not the same thing as sort of this hedonic, wanting to feel pleasure.
People who become addicted to things, let's call them addicts, have this feeling that normal life isn't interesting enough, that they are seeking a supernormal experience, and that the day-to-day routine, balance, which is actually in the title of your book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, that the word balance itself can sometimes be a bit of an aversive term for people. And I'm struck by this idea, and the reason I want to explore it is because so much of what I see online is about generating a lack of balance, about being tilted forward at all times, really leaning into life hard, experiencing life, living a full life. Even the commencement speech given by Steve Jobs on this campus was really about finding passion, digging, that's so much in the narrative now. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your experience with this association, if it really exists, between people's sense of the normalcy or maybe even how boring life can be and their tendency to become addicts of some sort.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that life for humans has always been hard, but I think that now it's harder in unprecedented ways. And I think that the way that life is really hard now is that it actually is really boring. And the reason that it's boring is because all of our survival needs are met, right? I mean, we don't even have to leave our homes to meet every single physical need, as long as you're of a certain level of financial well-being, which frankly, we talk so much about, the income gap, and certainly there is this enormous gap between rich and poor, but that gap is smaller than it's ever been in like the history of humans. Even the poorest of the poor have more excess income to spend on leisure goods than they ever have before in human history. If you look at leisure time, for example, so people without a high school education have 42% more leisure time than people with a college degree. So my point here is that life is hard now in this really weird way, in that we don't really have anything that we have to do. So we're all forced to make stuff up, whether it's being a scientist or being a doctor or being an Olympic athlete or, climbing Mount Everest. And people really vary in their need for friction. And some people need a lot more than others. And if they don't have it, they're really, really unhappy.